Oh, hello. Hello. Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and Rosemary. I confess I came by car tonight. I apologise. I had a very soft American I'm taking around, and he couldn't sit on the back of my bike. But anyway, he'll come right. It's pathetic, isn't it? Yes. Anyway, welcome everybody, and the topic that our maestro produced a film on, which is in the press today, linking to the press website to see what Gerard Smythe and crew have produced for it on water in Canterbury and nitrates in Canterbury. So well done. And that's the end of your series, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Yes, so
yes, we have no tenure.
So if you don't get funding, will you go somewhere else?
Yes, I'll probably go to Oamaru or something.
Yes, I know. It's a pleasant thought. How can we help?
You could bow me on your bike.
Yeah, I could W to Oamaru on my bike.
Is the American here, and will he be offended that you called himself?
He or she?
It's a he, and he. No, he's very. Yes, he quite likely would actually. No, he's not. And he's very polite, which I'm finding really hard to handle. But anyway, so anyway, it's great to have a regional councillor here who dragged the average age down considerably when she succeeded in sitting around the table. But Pham has been a sterling success, wonderful success at the regional council, and it's great to have her here tonight. So put your hands together and welcome.
Okay, this feels super weird. Can I take this off?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Otherwise, my neck starts to get a bit robotic and it feels weird. Thank you, Gary. That was a lovely introduction. And thank you all, so many of you, for coming this evening. It's really cosy in here and it feels like a really nice, vibe. So, body heat, exactly. So, kia ora, as Gary said, my name is Pham, and I often introduce myself by saying I have both the privilege and the pain of currently being one of your ECan councillors, and I really don't use the word pain lightly in that. There are real serious challenges that we're facing as a region, and I'm going to be touching on those tonight. I actually,
Here's your chips.
well, here's my chips. Thank you, Gary.
I'll eat them.
I actually really don't feel like I can keep going without acknowledging actually some really sad news that just yesterday, and this will be news to a few of you here tonight, Murray Rogers of Water Rights Trust passed away. And Murray, as you all know, was a real stalwart for water in Canterbury and put so much effort and passion into these very issues that I'm talking about tonight. And I just, there's a lot of quotes that I could have grabbed from Murray. And he also authored the book, was it Wicked Water? Canterbury's Wicked Water? Yeah, and that was, I think he published that just over a decade ago now. But I just wanted to start with a quote from Murray, just one I plucked out from an opinion piece in 2015, and he said, just like that?
Yes.
Thank you. Healthy ecology in our rivers, streams and lakes and aquifers that are safe to drink from is our heritage. And it is socially and economically irresponsible to provide our descendants with anything less, especially as we know what is required. And yeah, I mean, really, that sums up, I think, the message of tonight. And It's that we're facing these big issues, but actually we know what's required. We just need the tools to actually make some progress on them. And I think as well, I like to always acknowledge the biggest environmental threat at this point in history, and that is climate change, and that climate change and water and all these issues are inextricably linked, and that although I'm focusing on nitrates tonight and the pollution of nitrates of Canterbury's water, this is really about the absolute necessity to have reliable sources of water to rely on for future generations when they don't have the luxury of spending all our resources, all our finances and that kind of thing into fixing these things when they're actually fighting much bigger battles. So this is on us to get this right now. And I've probably really gone straight to the end of my talk, but this is a beautiful photo from Shannon Crowe, and I want to thank Shannon for passing his photo on to me to use. Now, the way I'm going to approach tonight is I am going to give a really brief snapshot of the nitrate issue in Canterbury, and I'm going to do that by drawing on ECan's latest groundwater report. But seeing how the screen's quite small, and I've got quite a few graphs that I've just plucked out of the report, so it's not about the details. I'm really going to breeze over those, and then when we get to the end we can discuss specific things that people want to. What I really want to focus most of my time on is actually talking about Christchurch's issues when it comes to nitrates, because this is the issue that we can influence and actually change in the course of this plan change, which I'll talk about coming up. So let's jump into things. So nitrates, thank Gary. So nitrates in Canterbury, where do they come from? Nitrates or nitrogen is a very essential part of nature. It's a natural part of our environment, and it's critical in plant production and a whole bunch of things. But our issue here in Canterbury, and thank you for this graph, Axel, that he just drew these numbers off. Was it MFE or Stats New Zealand? Stats New Zealand. And these are just cattle in Canterbury showing beef cattle in the orange and dairy cattle in the blue. And you can see, basically, this is our issue in Canterbury. Now, why cattle are an issue for nitrates is the basics is that we have quite nitrogen high grass, and usually this is as a result of us using quite excessive nitrogen fertilisers, which then the cows eat, and then the nitrates are excreted through their urine in really high dense patches, which then filter through our really light soils and gravels and then make their way through the groundwater into our streams and rivers. And that's the basics of our nitrate issue in Canterbury, and this is why we're getting there. When we're talking about nitrates or nitrogen, there's a whole bunch of numbers which get thrown around. And you won't be able to see the screen, but basically this was just a chart to show you the basics about those numbers. And tonight, probably the primary number, and one that you'll hear a lot, is the drinking water standard. And they call that the MAV, the maximum allowable value. And currently the drinking water standard in New Zealand is 11.3 milligrams. What is really important to know with the drinking water standard is that is simply about human health. And humans can actually, well, we'll talk about emerging research in a moment, but humans can actually take quite a lot of nitrates and we seem to be relatively okay as far as the science goes. When it comes to the creatures in the waterways, particularly our fish and our invertebrates, their ability to assimilate nitrates is much lower than humans, and they're actually very badly affected by levels of nitrate. Oh, go on. Yeah, thank you. And that's why in the NPS, or the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water, the toxic level for creatures in our waterways is 6.9 milligrams per litre. Now, I'll probably leave that there. That's probably the basics of what you need to know about the numbers. But that natural nitrates in Canterbury are anywhere between 0 and 2 milligrams per litre. Now I'm just going to really briefly give you a snapshot of 2 graphs that are part of Environment Canterbury's recent groundwater report. So the first one is a summary of nitrate concentrations which were sampled well, it says 2018 there, but I think it's actually 2017 data. But this is the most recent data that we have. Now, again, this is looking at human health and the drinking water standard. So it's saying the red is groundwater bores which exceed the maximum allowable drinking water standard. The yellow is anywhere between what's called half MAV, or half the maximum allowable value, and 11, which is actually a real danger zone. It means as soon as you get to half MAV, or those orange colours, you need to start monitoring your water because you don't want to be exceeding it at all. And yeah, I mean, you can see that it's an issue across Canterbury, least in Christchurch, West Melton, but most in mid-Canterbury, Selwyn, Te Waihora area, and also Ashburton. But it really is an issue across the board. Here we have it's the same bores which we sample, which is about 306 bores across Canterbury. But here we have a 10-year trend in the nitrate concentration. So this is from 2009 to 2018 for this graph. And what we see here is, well, the red triangles show that nitrate is actually increasing over the 10-year period. The yellows are that there's no trend in nitrate, and the greens is that nitrate is decreasing. Now, what is really concerning, and I've just pulled it out from the summary here. What concerns me is actually the 77% of wells that show no decreasing or increasing trends in nitrate. Because our groundwater survey only covers a 10-year period, we're looking at quite recent developments, and what these 10-year trends don't tell you is whether these numbers and these improvements are actually ecologically meaningful, or are they just statistically significant? And there's a difference between those things. And this is a real issue in the way that LAWA, or Land and Water Aotearoa, are currently reporting a lot of our environmental statistics for New Zealand, and they're often using 10-year trends. Now, what this means is that 10 years ago, in a lot of areas in New Zealand, we already have seen serious decline in our environment. So when we're picking up no trends, it could simply just mean that it's already declined and now it's just basically stagnant. So this was, I guess, the main area which I've been asking ECan that we need to look at a longer term data set, and actually they've agreed that that is a really important step and we need to be looking at that. So watch this space. I wanted to really briefly, because that's like at a high level across Canterbury, but I wanted to pick on the Selwyn or Te Waihora area just to give you a feeling of what these nitrates actually mean, because I think when we spread it across Canterbury and we're talking about specific drinking water bores, you can kind of miss how big the cumulative issue is. And this is a graph which I borrowed from Mike Glover, who's a really active part of the Selwyn community. Now, obviously you can't read that, but I wanted to just draw your attention to the bottom right here, and that says 62 tonnes, and that's the community sewerage contribution in Selwyn to the nitrate issue in Selwyn. And you don't need to know any of the numbers, but I wanted to show you the rest of the graph, because the left-hand side is the farming contribution to nitrates. And Mike always talks about how this really blows out of the water, the idea that we're all in this together and that we all need to, reduce our pollution. So this is the full graph, and you won't be able to see, but yeah, the community contribution is down the bottom there. And then I think it's about 6 feet high. That is the farming contribution in the catchment. And what is really concerning about this, and it captures it really well, is that in the Selwyn, there's rules here which have been set by Environment Canterbury, which, although are a really great starting point, they essentially are the things that are taking us from the very top of the graph, which is 5,600 tonnes, and it's reducing the total tonnage of nitrogen or nitrates going into Lake Te Waihora to 4,800 tonnes in the future. So, and I don't want that kind of sounds like an improvement. Now, unfortunately, right now we're actually at, sorry, I'm just going to point here, 3,200 tonnes. So all it means is that Te Waihora, which is already hugely polluted, is just going to get worse. Sorry, Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora. Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora. Yeah, and I can talk more about those issues as we go.
Just say the both of them, because
yes, I'm so sorry.
Very exotic.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. You're right. You're right. No, you're right. You're right. I should say both.
Okay, enough.
Its official legal name by the Geographical Board is Te Waihora, Ellesmere, or the other way around. Just for that.
Yes. No, thank you. Now, okay, so here we are. We've got the sort of picture of Canterbury nitrates, but as you're probably aware, the nitrate issue has been really, hot in the media recently, and that's particularly because there's been a Danish study which looked at 2.7 million people over 23 years, and it was really, there's actually been other international studies which have drawn a link between the impact of nitrates on human health, but not at such a big scale. And this is why this kind of, sent out ripples in the scientific community. What they found is that they found statistically significant increases in colorectal cancer at very low levels of nitrates, and we're talking 0.87 milligrams of nitrogen, and they found a 15% increase in the occurrence of cancer for those who were drinking water of 2.1 milligrams per litre. And this is all context as we're going forward into talking about the Christchurch situation, so we'll come back to those numbers.
Was that a double-blind study?
Yes, of over 1,000.
A double-blind study.
Yes, multiple studies.
Yeah, it was. I don't know what exactly that terminology refers to, but I should.
Epidemiological. It's a population over time.
Yeah,
How can
it's
you
huge.
ever-
That they actually did take into account a whole lot of variables.
Right.
It's not an experiment.
No, it was
Hang on. Just questions at the end.
Okay. Yeah, but it really, like, I mean, I think you should read it.
I think the answer's no.
Also, I like just recently, and this is just highlighting the gist of it, but Iowa, Delaware, Arizona, and California, a recent study has just shown that they've got real concern for their population, because they are finding about 10 cases per 100,000 population. And that is alarming. Unfortunately, in New Zealand, we have one of the highest rates of bowel cancer in the world. And the highest rates are actually in South Canterbury, where we find a lot of the really massive nitrate issues. And again, you know, correlation does not mean causation. I agree. But there is real concern there. They have 86.5 cases per 100,000 in South Canterbury. So it's, yeah, really a concern. I wanted to really briefly give you some context as we go into the talk about what does this mean for Christchurch's water, because Environment Canterbury does have a planning framework to manage nitrates, and basically that came from what's called the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, which has been in place for about a decade now. And the main document which guides those rules is the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. There's a lot of rules in that plan, but the primary one for nitrogen or nitrates is that it sets farming or holds farmers to what's called a baseline level of nitrate loss. And that's basically whatever they were leaching between 2009 and 2013 on average, they can no longer leach more than that. That's what the broad plan says. As part of that planning process though, because that baseline was for the whole of the region, but then Environment Canterbury have been going through zone by zone, and Canterbury's split into 10 zones. And zone by zone, we've been setting specific rules for each sub-region. And this is where the Waimakariri and Christchurch plan comes into it. So currently we are about to notify rules for what's called the OTOP or Orari Temuka Opihi Pariora zone, and that's in South Canterbury. But we're also about to notify rules for the Waimakariri zone, and this is where Christchurch water comes into it. So just for a really brief 101 about Christchurch's water, here we have the Rakaia alluvial fan, which brings in Selwyn Te Waihora's water. And up above that we have the Waimakariri alluvial fan. And this is the broad direction which water flows. And I've got to shout out to Tim Davies at ECan who lent me his slides for this. And this is the broad way that water flows, where Banks Peninsula actually splits the way that water flows. And the Waimakariri in history actually used to come down through Lake Ellesmere, Te Waihora. We know that in a very simplistic way, there's unconfined and semi-confined aquifers, but then as they come towards the Christchurch coast, they become somewhat confined. And that's a really simplistic diagram at the top, but our aquifers more look like something like this. This is the 3D version, where you can see that there's not totally separate layers. It's actually one big interconnected system. So in Christchurch, ECan has luckily, acknowledged how important Christchurch's drinking water has been, and they've had in place this protection zone across this areas where we used to believe the source water came from. And there's really tight controls on land use in this area, restricting activities within the zone. And that's things like you can't irrigate, you can't intensify, basic things like that in order to protect the groundwater. Science I think it first came out at the end of last year, and that basically was a whole bunch of testing of groundwater and movement and levels of groundwater, which expanded our knowledge of where Christchurch's drinking water comes from. And we now know that some of it comes from north of the Waimakariri River. And I'll just show you what that looks like. So here's the Waimakariri River. We used to think that the Waimakariri River actually acted as a hydraulic boundary, so that anything north of the Waimakariri didn't infiltrate Christchurch. About 2/3 of our water comes from the Waimakariri itself, but about 1/3 of our water we thought initially comes from this area, and that's all land surface discharge, which basically means when it rains, the water filters through the soil and into our aquifers. And now we know from this new science that actually this area north of the Waimakariri is also responsible for our source water. And unfortunately, I think you can see there's a lot of pivot irrigator circles and a lot of agricultural development in this area. The Waimakariri Zone Committee, I mentioned how the Canterbury is split into 10 zones, and each zone has a zone committee. The Waimakariri Zone Committee, at the end of last year, put out what's called their Draft Zone Implementation Program Addendum. A very catchy title. And unfortunately, deep within that zipper, for short, was a recommendation for the Christchurch Community Supplies that recommended a planned limit for Christchurch's aquifers of 3.8 milligrams. I'm sorry, you just definitely can't read that, but they recommended 3.8 milligrams.
Of what?
Of nitrates.
Milligrams per litre.
This is the area that the Zone Committee focused on for their recommendations in terms of putting more stringent rules on farming activities in these areas above that of what is required of the rest of the region. Now, don't worry about the colours there, but basically all the colours are showing is that there's different areas of risk within that source area, and that the farms, depending on where they are in those areas, would be subject to more stringent or less stringent rules, depending on where you are. And I can skip over that. I think the most depressing thing for me about these recommendations is that they recommended all these stages, and in a nutshell, it's for dairy, you've got to reduce your nitrate leaching by 10 to 15% every 10 years until 2060, when I will turn 74. And then, if all's gone well, we will have met the limit of 3.8 milligrams. That's the aim. That's best case scenario. Okay? Now, I need to give a little bit of context to that because a lot of people say that's not fair, it's not going to be 3.8 milligrams. You know, things like Christchurch City can take, you know, they can mix the water from different bores so that it's less than 3.8. And yes, there are management things that we could do. But I think with this issue, what I really struggle with because is the language around it's in 50 years, it might be in 100 years, you know, we just don't know, but we're not focusing on, we're not taking this precautionary approach. We're saying, oh, we don't know, so let's just keep doing what we're doing and make tiny little incremental changes that may get us somewhere. And actually the lag effects are so much that if we've screwed it up and got it wrong, we won't be able to do anything about it anyway. So, you know, future generations will have to worry about that. Yeah, that we can talk about that though. I think what really grinds my gears about this whole issue as well is that also buried in the Waimakariri zipper when they made this recommendation of 3.8 milligrams is that they called it a precautionary limit of 3.8 milligrams. And yeah, for so many reasons that was just completely inappropriate, and it's what I talked about when I voted against the recommendation of this limit. And I've been talking with a lot of scientists in this area, particularly Professor Graham Fenwick of NIWA, who's New Zealand's leading stygofauna expert. And stygofauna is the little critters that live in our aquifers and actually filtrate all the water and make it good. And I've been looking particularly, he's directed me towards his evidence for the Waikoropupu Springs Water Conservation Order, which you might have heard, it's a really beautiful clear spring in Golden Bay area, and the community have applied for it to become a water conservation order, and it would be the first time that we had an aquifer protected under a water conservation order. But that is exactly what we should be doing with Christchurch's water. Anyway, Graham Fenwick, as part of that, suggests a true precautionary limit, if we're talking about ecosystem health and protecting our aquifers, of about 0.4 to 0.5 milligrams. And also Chris Hickey, who's New Zealand's leading toxicologist in this area, also suggests, you know, 0.55 milligrams per litre, yeah. And yeah, I mean, I've just drawn out a few bits of information which I'm going to try put in a really easy to use way that people can submit on this issue when it becomes publicly notified, is that, and that's the last point, that available research evidence, and there is evidence, there's so much evidence out there, empirically demonstrate that this standard, and that's talking about the drinking water standard, designed to protect human health, is inappropriate for ensuring the health of aquatic ecosystems and invertebrates under long-term exposure. And that, yeah, that really just sums it up. But I really want to assure you that you can have a voice in this issue, and so can ideally the whole of Christchurch or Canterbury or New Zealand. So this has been a bit of a moving feast in terms of dates, but the current dates we have is that Council on July 11th will be publicly notifying this plan change, and I'll actually be supporting that in terms of it finally being open again for public submissions. And the public submissions will likely open about July 20th. There'll be a hearing convened by an independent panel, likely to begin early next year, and then there's a decision and appeals. Because we're still under the Environment Canterbury Transitional Act, appeals are actually limited to points of law, so we can't go to the Environment Court at this point. Yeah. So that is the, oh my gosh, it's almost 50 minutes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's the end of my spiel about the numbers and the nitrates. Thank you so much for listening. I guess just to summarise, what we're really missing in this whole equation is looking at the actual economic impact of these issues, because all we look at when we talk about economics is the farm operating surplus of the farms in the areas, and we're not expanding it to look at, for example, the whole metropolitan city of Christchurch potentially having to treat their drinking water in the future, which you just can't, you can't believe that this is an issue in 2019. But we're still not getting these kind of fundamental issues right. We still need to be using our voices, using the process to actually change these things. So, I'll leave it there, and thank you for listening.
I can tell Lan that her chips were absolutely delicious. Some more are coming.
My question relates to bottled water, and I'd like to know what the nitrate levels would be if they're taking the water out of the bores, and the bores are blah 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 whatever nitrates. Does that mean that the bottled water is full of nitrates? I'm not quite too sure.
No. So right now, Christchurch's water is totally safe and pristine. And that is where the majority of the bottled water consents are. Now, international standards for bottled water are stringent, like they are so stringent. So there is no way that water bottling would continue in Canterbury, well, particularly in Christchurch, if there was nitrate contamination.
Lan, thank you. I learned heaps. If there were 12, is it 12 councillors at ECan? Or
Yes, currently 12, and there'll be 14 next
Right.
time round.
if they all wanted what you want, what power would they have to beat the bureaucrats? That's what I worry about.
It's not
bureaucrats.
The current laws.
No.
Well, the current laws, what power does the elected body have?
Yeah, so currently, we're in the situation where we're still half elected, half government appointed. But return to democracy is coming this October.
Sort of?
No, full democracy.
No stacked votes from the country areas?
South Canterbury gerrymandering.
Come on.
Yes, okay. That's an issue.
So nearly full democracy.
Yeah.
One question, Gerard.
Although
They were stacked votes.
I am told consistently when I mention that it was the structure of ECan pre-sacking
Right.
of the councillors.
But what do you think about my question?
Yes. I think the main challenge for this incoming council, even if, say we had this great environmentally minded majority, it's going to be to absolutely strategically push central government to change the Resource Management Act as a starting point, because the framework is there in the Resource Management Act, but case law has basically dictated that the environment is not given primacy. And not only that though, that when we're looking at the economics, we're looking at such a narrow, short-term economics. If we were really looking at long-term economics, this would be a different picture. But we're not. We're just, we're still just doing what we've always been doing, and we're not broadening our perspective. There will be a lot of constraints on a new council. The constraints that we face right now under the Resource Management Act.
So you're not that effective?
Oh, no. No, we're not effective. We're not effective. And this is the thing. This is what I always... there's no good news stories here. And actually for an incoming council, there will not be good news stories. There are huge challenges here that even if we had the most amazing council in the world, it will take us decades. And that's how overwhelming and often crippling these issues are, because it's so frustrating that we are not turning off the tap. We are just muddling along, just ignoring these things. And that's the frustration. So thank you for your question.
Chrissy.
A quick comment and then a question. So the comment is that in your last slide you talked about a hearings panel being making the decision. Councillors have to take the decision of that hearings panel unless they send it back to a new panel. So if that panel is set by the current council, the new council will have very little influence. My question, and it's reflecting on a letter to the editor this morning, was about the increasing intensity of rural residential in the Waimakariri District Council and the impact of that, particularly the number of septic tanks and poorly controlled sewage outfalls. Do we have any indication of how that discharge compares with the dairy farm influence?
Not that I know of, certainly not specifically for the Waimakariri, and I'm not sure, that really brief example that I showed of the Selwyn septic tanks, the community sewage in Selwyn, I actually have no idea of how wide that scope is and how many...
And you've got the same rural residential.
Yeah, the rural residential balance is totally different. So no, Chrissy, I don't. But that's a really good question.
So just to put this in context, it took us 30 years ago, we had 3 times the number of sheep on our land in New Zealand and half the number of cows. And it took us those 30 years to get from there to where we are today. So looking at the next 30 years, and also considering that we've got the entire agricultural sector, whether you talk to federated farmers, Ngaitahu farming, the primary sector council, anyone out there has in effect read the writing on the wall. The ship is glacially slowly transforming from essentially a mass commodity output export to a small value-added output for the world. That is a glacial process that we're only starting to see the beginning of, but we've got again those groups like the primary sector council, like the Canterbury mayoral forum and such, who are actually saying that we need to essentially do this massive shift. We need to rewrite how we're doing farming and land management on the plains. Where do you see as being the best fulcrums for us to actually accomplish that? To sit down with industry, governance, community, and for mostly iwi, and to actually start to have a look at the map and say, okay, we obviously shouldn't be doing this on this soil profile and so forth. How do we actually get that holistic view that's not just trench warfare?
In short, I don't know. I want to give you an example of, this process where industry were totally there, they came on board, they talked for years, they reached a consensus, and that consensus is good management practice. Good management practice is getting us, if we're here, it's getting us here, and actually meaningful ecological improvement is here. So I don't know if that kind of beautiful picture of primary industries and everyone just realising that this is what they have to do, I don't know if that is possible. I feel like it needs to be in some way, I totally believe in particularly catchment specific community processes, but in some way this is where central government needs to come in, and this is why I'm really heartened by the current groups which are part of the figuring out these changes to the national policy statement for fresh water. And right now they are debating, literally last week they were having fights about it, the bottom line nitrate number that will be, which the national policy statement for fresh water could change to. So right now the bottom line is 6.9 milligrams. The scientific bottom line that they're talking about is 0.4 or 0.5. I think, no, it was 0.88. Sorry, the precautionary is 0.4, 0.5. But the bottom line is 0.88. And the science group were told, tell us the science without any economic or social restrictions. And that's what they came up with, and that's what they agree with. Now, as you can imagine, the regional sectors, which are also involved in these discussions, are just losing it. But this is what frustrates me. Why are we mucking around with silly numbers which don't give us any ecologically meaningful change? We're just kidding ourselves. Let's just go straight to what actually matters and will change things and will improve our environment. And that's how we actually get progress. And then we figure out how we're going to get there.
Hi, Lan. That was a very interesting little segue actually into what I was interested to know, which was in the ideal world, which is actually the point that you've just talked about if only we could get there right now. What do you think it would look like in Canterbury, and bearing in mind that we've got to probably take into account the economic, social and ecological well-being, if you could just snap your fingers and get to that point, and I don't think anyone would disagree that the numbers tend to favour very low numbers, what do you think it would actually look like? And how would another world, your ideal world, look to us, and what would it mean for Canterbury and this city and everybody that lives here?
I would love, I've thought about this quite a bit because people, they often say, well, what does it look like? And I feel like the way the world is going in terms of recognising the importance of locally produced food, local economies, circular economies, we're trying to eliminate all this waste and transport and fossil fuels and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and everything. Or how do we at least minimize them and create this really exciting economy that people want to be part of? Because I think, and I have a lot of sympathy for landowners out there who are struggling, particularly with their incredibly high debt levels. And this is no fairy tale for them. This is serious stuff where they are impacted by, even these cuts that I say, oh, isn't that silly? It's 15% cut of nitrogen over 10 years. For them, that is crippling. It's crippling their debt. It's crippling their income, over the next 10 years or whatever. But for them, I think the government actually needs to be thinking about welfare packages. This is about actually cutting the ties that these people have created in, bad decision making, essentially. But I feel like as a society, we've definitely supported that, and we've been okay with them, intensifying up to the eyeballs. Sorry, I'm totally diverting from your actual question, but I think there's a great future if we, particularly as Canterbury, said, you know what, we are going to turn insular. We're going to look at ourselves. We're going to create our own, maybe we're going to source our food from within Canterbury. And what does that look like economically? What opportunities does that hold? So something along those lines, but I don't have all the answers, definitely not.
I just wanted to say that the water system, it's a gravitational flow, and it's almost like the reverse of a tea bag. So from the mountains, the tea bag is dry, but by the time it gets to Christchurch, it's fully saturated with all of the crap that goes with it, because it flows through the water. And Canterbury Plains is very much like a sieve. As your screen showed, the water, it's like cutting your finger and going, oh, well, that's okay, it's only my finger. But if there's no coagulant in your finger and your brain goes, oh gosh, shit, I need water to survive, and it's like this little flow, but it becomes a big one, because I can remember between Ashburton and Christchurch there used to be a lot of forestry, and it's been cut down to supply dairy. You know, there have been a lot of trees that have been moved to supply land for cattle and intensification, and the land was good for crop growing, but the amount of water that gets distributed to wash down the cow poo, and it all flows through into the aquifer, and it's all connected, and you go from one district to another, and the water just it merges.
Thank you.
Yeah, what about Fonterra's model of, you know, it's unsustainable, you know, and James Shaw was at a meeting before the last election talking about, you know, the lead comes from the processing of the milk. If they just insisted on milk from regenerative agriculture and didn't just sit with that model that they have now, where the majority is everything else unsustainable. So why can't people put pressure on growing regenerative milk processing factories and saying, we'll only have that, we can get more money for that, we'll start in that area? Well, you know, is that a way through?
Well, you actually raise a really good point about Fonterra, and there's just been a recent legislation change for the guiding legislation which restricts Fonterra, and that's called the DAERA Act for short, but it's like Dairy something Act. Thank you. And the changes to the DAERA Act, they are positive. They now allow Fonterra to reject milk if the farmers don't satisfy environmental grounds. Now, before that, Fonterra have had to, by law, pick up milk no matter where these dairy farms pop up. And so you can imagine in areas like the Mackenzie, you know, Fonterra, in terms of business sense, they don't want to be associated with dairy farms in the Mackenzie, but they have had to, by law, pick up that milk. Now, yeah, there's been this change to the Act, and personally I feel like, unfortunately, it's not enough, because on environmental grounds means that they would then have to put the onus on the farmer, like how environmental is environmental. I mean, there will be blatant examples where they can say, look, we're just not getting involved with you. But there's going to be this constant to and fro about how environmental are you or not, and I guess they'll have to prove that they're not environmental enough, when really, ideally, it would have been Fonterra can make the decision, you know, no matter what, whether that be transport costs, emissions, whatever it is, giving them the power to do that. But I feel like it hasn't gone far enough, although it sounds positive.
Hang on. As I pass John Patterson, he'll tell you, Lan, that he passed 74 some years ago, and it's quite a lot of fun. So when you get there, you'll really enjoy it.
I'm hoping. I'm looking forward to it.
I was way beyond the top step on that.
I hope I'm remembering this correctly. On the map of Christchurch with the well quality data over the 10 years, there's one well that shows an increase in nitrate level. Is that correct?
Oh, gosh.
It's in the far north around the Styx River area.
Sorry.
Next one, I think.
Yeah, next one.
Forward. Yeah, it's around about,
By the sea of Christchurch.
Yes.
Kapatoni Stream or Styx River, perhaps.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that well, like how deep it is, and the fact that it's in that zone of flow from the Waimakariri
Yeah.
catchment, might that be its source?
Yes. So I can't tell you about the exact bore because there's 306 in the survey and I don't know them in any detail. I do know in that area, so the modelling for the Waimakariri, the modelling that shows that the nitrates are coming under the Waimakariri River, when Environment Canterbury talks about that, often they use the terms, there's no evidence to show that these nitrate levels will actually rise in Christchurch's water, which is not actually true because as part of the model, wells around in the northern part of Christchurch, particularly around Belfast, they are showing increases in line with the model. So, and this is in the range of, I think they're heading towards 2 or 2-ish milligrams per litre. To me, it's confirming that these risks are not totally theoretical. They are happening now, and we can likely, be expecting these nitrates in Christchurch's drinking water. So that might be what that well is signalling, but I'm not sure.
The canary in the coal mines.
It could be. Like I said, I don't know in serious detail about what this map means and whether it's the Kapitonu or not. But yeah, it well could be.
Lan, could you say something about lag times? Because that's the other issue you haven't covered.
Thank you, Rosemary. Lag times are the issue when it comes to water in Canterbury, and I'm sorry I haven't actually spent a bit of time on it, but basically in some of our areas, the lag time refers to the period of time where water seeps through the ground and goes into our groundwater and then either resurfaces in our springs or in other groundwater bores and that kind of thing. Now in Canterbury, that can range anywhere from short lag times of about 2 to 10 years, or there can be really, really long lag times of, 100 years plus, which is often the real depressing thing about Canterbury's use of water, where we have so much water that is used for irrigation, and a lot of that water is like pristine, like 120-year-old, aquifer water, and yeah, it shows again how we're not getting the fundamentals right. Why are we not valuing this water in the way that we should be? And I get that where we've come from, we have come from a past of thinking water is plentiful, it's water for everyone, but increasingly we know that's not how the world works and how our water system works. So we really need to be changing the way we manage these amazing resources.
Thanks, Lan. That's really helpful in terms of some good, clear data for me as a city councillor, because often unfortunately, when I've asked ECan staff, the data has seemed to vary from each presentation. So thank you for yours. It was good and clear. I wanted to ask you about the impact of the superphosphates and fertilisers, and just starting with the facts and the measurements, Lan, how in fact can ECan make sure we get away from dependence on, say, Overseer, which we know is partly funded by the fertiliser companies, so it doesn't end up looking dodgy. And the other part of the question too, Lan, is what other alternatives should ECan really be, alternative fertilisers, natural fertilisers, organic fertilisers, what ways could ECan actually really promote those as alternatives?
Interesting, Phil. Personally, when it comes to the fundamentals of should ECan be promoting, different alternatives, I would feel like there needs to be a significant shift in terms of the Local Government Act to enable that, because basically we would be promoting a product over another product. And yeah, there's some real issues with that, as I'm sure you can imagine. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to So,
overseer as well.
overseer. Thank you. Overseer has so many flaws, and this has been outlined by the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment. I think what we need to be aware of with overseer is that, and this is what Simon Upton said in the report. It's that when overseer is when you're trying to use overseer for
What is overseer?
sorry, overseer is a nitrogen software which models when you put X amount of nitrogen fertilizer on your farm, how much is lost under the root zone, how much goes to your grass. You know, it models that, and it spits out numbers, and that's what ECan's planning framework is based on.
And it's a Ravensdown product, is that correct?
It's half owned by a collective of Ravensdown and Balance, and then half Crown owned. But in the latest budget, the government has just put a lot more money into overseer because they know how important this is. It's part of that 229 million for freshwater. I'm not sure how much exactly. But so Simon Upton said, where you're trying to use overseer for really specific farm management is not fit for purpose. It can be out 30 to 60%. It's not fit for purpose. Where, and this was the key sentence, where you are so far away from ecologically meaningful, ecologically functional environments, which we are in Canterbury, we are just like so struggling. Overseer works because it simply tells you whether you are tracking in the right direction or not. So yeah, I'm a bit careful to sort of throw out overseer. I think there is no other tool currently. There's no other reliable tool, and so if we want to be sure that we are heading in the right direction, right now, unfortunately, we need overseer, and we need it to improve in so many ways, and that's why I'm so glad the government have thrown some money at it.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful line to... Yeah, thank you. Swap mics. That's a wonderful line to finish on. The thing that I've found really wonderful tonight is to hear a great scientific brain at elected level, which is, I might say, a rarity. And I think that it's very important that we support the land farms of the world, and there are a number of candidates here for ECan who are all committed to the same. Those are your chips, by the way. I ate the last lot. Phil ate quite a few of them too. But it is really important that we actually get in behind good candidates in local government, and we don't actually just support half-wits that stand up and make all the sort of gobbledy-gobbledy-gob. No, well, yeah, you. I got through by mistake, John, but all I can say is that you did help me put my signs up. So, look, I think we all agree, Lan, that was superb. Thank you very much. Next week, we've got David Mates, the Chief Executive of the District Health Board. I sent him a text the other day saying I noted that the Labour government had appointed one of the National Party people to monitor the District Health Board, and he and I have agreed that he will come along and talk to us all about the District Health Board. So that will be a ripper. So see you next week. Thanks for coming.